Greetings, listeners. This podcast you're about to listen to is brought to you by the Network in Canadian History and Environment, a not-for-profit public history organization that publishes new research on the intersection of nature and history in Canada. They publish blogs, research articles, newsletters, and this very podcast you're about to listen to, and they can't do it without your support. If you enjoy this podcast and all the great work of the Network in Canadian History and Environment, consider becoming a supporter. Head on over to niche-canada.org/support and make a donation today. Toxic legacies on Indigenous lands.
Water pollution happened as a result of leakage into and tailings into the Serpent River watershed, and this caused documented problems with fish spawning, radioactivity, trapping, the ability to fish.
The history of uranium mining and its consequences at Elliot Lake on the lands of Serpent River First Nation. I'm Sean Courage, and you're listening to episode 75 of Nature's Past, a podcast of the Network in Canadian History and Environment. The nuclear arms race and global confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union in the mid-20th century brought new settler pressures on the resources of Indigenous peoples in Ontario. At Elliot Lake, on the territories of the Serpent River Anishinaabeg, the Canadian government and private corporations sought to extract uranium and other mineral resources in part of what historian Leanne Leddy calls Cold War colonialism. The mining activities at Elliot Lake produced toxic hazards with consequences for the people of Serpent River First Nation who lived with those environmental legacies. Traditional practices of fishing and hunting among the people of this homeland were jeopardized by the extractive industrial activities of the settler government and private corporations. In response, members of Serpent River First Nation resisted and fought for remediation of their traditional territories, a fight that continues to this day. This complicated history is explored in Leanne Leddy's new book, Serpent River Resurgence, Confronting Uranium Mining at Elliot Lake, published by University of Toronto Press. I caught up with Leanne to learn more about this history.
My name is Leanne Leddy. I'm Anishinaabeg from Serpent River First Nation. I grew up in Elliot Lake, Ontario. My mother is Anishinaabeg as well, and my father is a settler miner who himself comes from a mining family, a mining tradition. So I'm also an associate professor in the Department of History at Wilfrid Laurier University, and thanks, Sean, for having me here today.
Thanks for joining us, Leanne. I'm really excited to get to talk about your book and to introduce it to listeners to the podcast. So maybe to get us started, could you tell us a bit about Elliot Lake and Serpent River, what the environments are like in this area, and then we'll start to get into some of the history that you explore in this book.
Yeah, so the territory that we're talking about is Anishinaabe land in the Robinson-Huron Treaty Area. And so more specifically, we're talking about the North Shore of Lake Huron. So it is shield country, breathtaking colors in the fall, the landscape of waterways, lakes and rivers. Elliot Lake as a town is a relatively new settler development arising from the 1950s and is situated on Anishinaabe traditional territory. And the communities are both linked by the Serpent River watershed, which is key to the study that we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm. So this region of Ontario was sort of the object or the subject of interest in mining, became the site of uranium mining in the 1950s, beginning in the 1950s, and then an acid mine site as well that you explore in the book. And you cover some of the ways in which mining damaged these environments. So what were the effects of mining on the Elliot Lake area, and how did it affect the lives of the people of Serpent River First Nation?
So you're right that uranium mining began in the context of the Cold War period. So few environmental protocols. And Canada, how this all developed was that Canada entered into a large uranium contract with the United States. And the area now known as Elliot Lake was chosen as a mining area based on the stakes that were claimed. And then a town site developed to house families that came to work in the mines, including my father's family, as I mentioned earlier. And so the effects of mining were two-pronged on Serpent River First Nation. So the first is that the health of the watershed was diminished as a result of uranium mining and in particular dam failures and tailings management site problems and things like that. And then also on the other hand, Indian Affairs facilitated the establishment of a uranium acid plant, a sulfuric acid plant on the reserve. And this was related to mining as a secondary industry. So water pollution happened as a result of leakage into and tailings into the Serpent River watershed, and this caused documented problems with fish spawning, radioactivity, trapping, the ability to fish. And there were also settler tourism operators who had actually communicated with provincial authorities about their concerns. And we can see, as historians, internal provincial government documentation of these issues as well, and even a report about radioactivity that was actually kept from the public for 2 years in the early 1960s. So these were problems that were well known by settler scientists and mining companies and government officials. But this wasn't necessarily communicated to the community, although elders remembered problems with beaver harvesting. Elders shared that with me about their families, which was something still that people relied on still at that time. They remember fish tasting poorly, a general decline in the river system. And there were also families that relied on the river for their water. And it wasn't until 1976, actually, that a letter from the government warned chief and council not to let anybody who took water from the river to drink it. So as I mentioned earlier, this was about more than a decade after the water quality report was released.
Mm-hmm.
So as my grandmother said about bringing her children to swim in the river, here we found out there was radium-226 in that river. And that was something that was not known in the community. And it impacted a lot of the ways that people interacted with the water on the territory, even though they weren't necessarily, people didn't share that knowledge with them. That's, scientific knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Those changes were still apparent. And at the same time, the Noranda acid plant, which, as I mentioned, was a sulfuric acid plant, caused problems in the middle of the reserve. So that's where it was located on the shore of Arid Bay of Lake Huron, and it caused deforestation, water pollution, and air pollution in the community as well. So when the plant closed, the site was not remediated, and contaminated rubble was present throughout that area where the plant was.
Mm-hmm.
And along with buildings and that later had to be blown up in the late 1960s and then not cleaned up again until the late 1980s.
And then there's an episode in the book where you discuss some of the, I'm gonna call it remediation, but that's in big quotation marks, that the Canadian government initiated at the acid mine site, but it was used as an exercise for the military.
Yeah, it was done between D&D and the Department of Indian Affairs, and they brought in one of the field squadrons to. It was a training exercise for live fire. And it actually, as one elder told me, it took them a couple of goes to get the building to actually come down. They joked somebody was heckling, bring in the Air Force. But in all seriousness, it actually, what it did do was it blew that contamination across a wider surface area, as you might expect in an explosion situation, and left a lot of that debris there. And so, in all seriousness, this caused lots of problems in the community. In that, as I mentioned, it's located on Arid Bay. It's very close to a lot of homes, not far from the community center, and so this is really quite a serious thing that was happening in the middle of the community, and parents trying to keep their children from playing in the rubble. Like this was really a very serious issue in the middle of the reserve. And so it was something that then took, so that happened in the late 1960s. It took until the late 1980s for there even to be another remediation after that time. So these are really long-standing concerns when you're talking about the lives of families experiencing this kind of contamination.
It was a really shocking part of the book, but illustrative of a profound disconnect between the colonial government and the people who live in the territory. So the acid mine site and the uranium mining activities were supposed to bring prosperity to the community, but they ended up leaving this damaging legacy of environmental degradation. So from your view then, what does the study reveal about the relationships among ecology, resource extraction, and colonialism in Canada?
So you're right that one of the big reasons that the acid plant was established on the reserve was economic, so jobs and also revenue, leasing revenue for the community. And so this is tied up in colonial patterns of leasing Indigenous land to help pay for First Nations, and I'll put this in quotation marks even though people can't see this, upkeep, right? So encouraging wage work that would then in turn reduce government spending on First Nations, and also assimilate people, especially in this context, we're talking about men, to work in waged environments, waged working conditions, and relatedly, then also less reliance on older traditional ways as well. So furthermore, we also see that this lease for the Noranda acid plant was tied to an old lumber lease for land that had not been fully returned to the community once that lease had ended. As a result of, again, as you mentioned, the fact that Indian Affairs and the federal government generally were, in the moderators of these processes, and I think that that's key here. So again, these transactions are framed by the colonial relationship of the time, and they were controlled through Ottawa and Indian Affairs, and so that's key to remember the ties between extraction and colonialism. And so in the larger picture here, we can see similar patterns that led to development of what is now Canada as a country. So these extractive activities on Indigenous territories, which further marginalize Indigenous people, and that assist in the development of the nation state. And so these activities continue to this day and are hallmarks of economic development plans of various levels of government. And in the case of uranium extraction at Elliot Lake, of course, this is also tied to Cold War security and larger international forces.
And I could see in the narrative that you weave in this book, this story about an environment being rapidly transformed with all kinds of unforeseen consequences, or consequences that should have been anticipated, that have these lasting impacts and legacies for the people who live in the communities where resources are extracted. And so it seems like you're telling a bit of a story about a disconnect between extractivism and its long-term effects on an ecosystem in a homeland, and really different perspectives. I've been thinking about this a lot after reading your book and reading Brittany Luby's book about Lake of the Woods, where similar phenomena occurs of short-term resource extraction with long-term ecological consequences for the people who live and have lived since time immemorial in these territories. So I guess that isn't so much a question as a comment there, but it is starting to weave together, I think, a story about colonialism in Canada. And I wonder if you could comment about what you're seeing more broadly across Canada, because I know you've worked with other historians of mining in Canada as well. Are there similar phenomena that you see to the case at Elliot Lake?
I think that's one of the most striking things that I have seen is the similarity. Obviously, the homelands are distinct. The people whose homes these are distinct. So I don't mean I want to make sure that the diversity of Indigenous peoples across what is now Canada is honored. But at the same time, I see a lot of these processes following similar, if you want to call them benchmarks or patterns, I guess is the better word. And so for me, when I've talked to John Sandlos or Arne Keeling, Brittany Luby, certainly her book resonated a great deal, even though that's a different process that's going on in her territory. So what I'm struck by is the continued marginalization of Indigenous people through these processes, and in fact, it's the erasure, I think, of Indigenous presence in these areas as well. Or the attempts of, at least in terms of thinking about people, Indigenous people are not at the forefront of the settler mindset when it comes to these processes, and so I think that is key then to why a lot of these gains, economic gains, if you want to think of them that way from an economic perspective, are so short-lived. And it's because I think we still see a lot of these territories as being hinterlands to larger settler communities in I'll say the Canadian South, I guess, or urban areas in Canada. And I think that's key to this, is that there isn't a sense that these are homelands. And I think that goes beyond, a world view clashing, which is certainly a big part of this. I think it goes to settler colonialism in general, which is, a short-term gain in a territory that is not one's own.
Yeah, and it seems to sort of cloud ecological thinking too, that if for the companies and the governments involved, these are not places that people live, then they seem very clearly not to consider the relationship between poisoning the water, poisoning the animals, and then poisoning the people. So you also connect this story to a global context, and you use the term Cold War colonialism to describe this history. Can you explain to listeners what this means and how it applies to this case study?
So I wanted to find a phrase that adequately captured the patterns that I was seeing in this case study. So at the time that and I'll contextualize this with at the time that I wrote this primary phase of the project, this is my dissertation. And so we're talking about 2006, mid aughts, I guess. And so a lot of the historical literature up to that point in Canada about Indigenous peoples was focused on earlier time periods. And if that, of course, has changed now, as we've talked about the historians just in the last few questions. But I was seeing that despite these changes to the Indian Act in 1951, the federal franchise for Indigenous people, or for status Indians specifically in 1960, and the general historical narratives that were popular at the time, that subsequent historians have also critiqued, but seeing the 1960s as this time of decolonization, a watershed decade in Canadian history, that didn't line up with what I was seeing in my own community's history. And so in particular, I was seeing that this larger geopolitical process, or these forces like the Cold War, influenced extraction on our territory. But these were experienced at a very local and intimate level of homeland. And so the extraction was tied to, as I've said before, federal contracts, but also provincial economic development, and even the establishment of a settler town that didn't exist before the Cold War. So we have all of these different levels of government that are involved. But the extraction further marginalized Serpent River First Nation. And it was facilitated by these colonial forces, like the Indian Act, the reserve system, Indian Affairs as a bureaucratic controlling department, and various levels of government that prioritized economic development over Indigenous wellness.
And it further complicates, I think, the narrative of Canadian as well as Western history for the post-war period as a period of economic boom or prosperity, demonstrating the ways in which that was inequitably distributed and the inequitable impacts of economic activity. So the title of the book uses the term resurgence, a reference to the resilience of the Serpent River First Nation in its resistance to encroachment on its territories and the degradation of the environment. How did the Serpent River First Nation fight back, resist, and seek restitution for the environmental damage that was caused by mining activity in the 20th century?
So first of all, thank you for asking that question, because it was one of my favorite parts of this work and one of the reasons why I came to this project in the first place. So, and it was seeing and hearing these stories at the community level, at the family level, and hearing about activism, political activism. And so my grandmother had been involved in some of these fights in the late 1970s into the 80s, and so this was something that these were stories I had grown up with, and then I later explored them as an historian, but it was a familiar story to me, and so I'll give you a few examples of this resistance that appear in the book as well. So in the late 1960s, to begin with, we see Chief Bill Mawasagi, who used local media to call attention to the remains of the acid plant. So this was before the blow up that we had talked about earlier in that military operation, but after the company had pulled out. And so he actually brought in the local newspaper, the Elliot Lake Standard, to witness what was going on, and framed it actually as an eyesore, which I think was really it was, but also I think it was a savvy use of local media as well, because he was able to demonstrate, like, look, this is a message we're sending at the side of the Trans-Canada Highway that is highly visible to people coming in, when one of the other industries or economic development businesses, I guess you could say, is tourism. So he's pointing to this juxtaposition between an abandoned acid plant and trying to get people into the area for fishing. And so we can see that kind of resistance that he was using then. And then in the 1970s, there were discussions that arose about the potential to expand uranium mining at Elliot Lake. And members of Serpent River First Nation attended Environmental Assessment Board hearings to voice their concerns against this, saying, our lived experience with uranium mining is very different. We didn't see the prosperity in the same way that the town did. They're vocal about their experiences with uranium mining, and drew attention to the river pollution as a result of mining activities, and also the impacts of the former acid plant site. And so they generally wanted a more cautious approach to development, and actually, got a seat at the table at those hearings to talk about those issues. Again, fighting back to what was really in the area a dominant narrative of economic prosperity that came as a result of uranium extraction, and wanting another boom to go forward. So, being that one of those lone voices who had concerns about how quickly this was going to happen again. And then finally, in the late 1980s, we see that Chief and Council still are left with the results of the military operation that blew the acid plant over a larger surface area, and it still had not been cleaned up. Obviously, people might be able to understand the frustration that people in the community were feeling as a result of this, of just being left with this mess. And so the leaders from the community were making presentations to government officials, standing committees, and the media were invited to see the issue for themselves. And some politicians, settler politicians, noticed that this kind of contamination would not have been allowed anywhere else in Canada. So there's an awareness or a growing awareness by this time of what we would call now environmental racism, that this is happening and allowed to happen in a reserve because it is an Indigenous community and not a settler community. And at the community level, we see members engaged in other forms of activism as well. So, namely, one of my favorites is that they positioned a large sign at the side of the highway that had quite a long quote, but they dedicated the site to the Department of Indian Affairs. for the I'm paraphrasing, but the relentless pursuit of good on our behalf, which obviously is a tongue-in-cheek, biting commentary on the colonial relationship, as Serpent River First Nation residents had experienced that at the hands of Indian Affairs.
And was there was also an episode where they took debris from the site and put it on the side of the road?
Yep, and lit fire to it. Yeah. And so, and these are sort of happening around the same time. And so, absolutely. This is activism at the community level. And as one elder told me, this happened while some of the leaders were actually in a meeting with government officials trying to say this is a really serious issue. And sure enough, this was what was going on at home. And so it brought national attention to this longstanding problem. Canadians were faced with the reality of environmental racism and the legacies of extraction in the middle of what is now Canada. And I think that was largely effective because it also resulted in action. It didn't take very long then at that point for the federal government to provide money for another round of cleanup.
And it seems too that during this process toward the late 20th century, women leaders in the community take a prominent role in what is sovereignty activism and environmental activism here. Is this something you notice then, that there's like a particular role that women end up playing in this case study, and does that connect to traditions of activism within the community?
What I found was women like my grandmother, Gertrude Lewis, Lorena Lewis, who was chief at one point during the Environmental Assessment Board hearings, Betty Jacobs. These were women, among others, but these were women who were politically active. Other women who were active in other political ways too in the community, like the resurgence of traditions and so on, and the protection of traditions. And so what I saw as men and women working together very, very effectively at the community leadership level to get answers about these issues. Lorena Lewis was our first female chief in the community. She also had an all-women council at one point. I think that definitely framed. Certainly, my grandmother, being who she was, helped frame who I saw, as an example, and my responsibilities as an Anishinaabe. And so I think that was a big part of the story as well. And chiefs like Earl Commanda and Peter Johnson working with women in the community as well to find answers to these questions.
And the narrative in your book ties this late 20th century activism nicely to a much longer tradition of land protection and water protection, and particularly these episodes in the early 20th century. Can you tell us a bit about the timber licensing as a kind of precursor to the mining in the mid 20th century?
As I mentioned earlier, the lumber lease was in the late 19th century, timber extraction becomes an important economic development pursuit in northern, or the near northern Ontario. I call it Northern Ontario, but there's
still more north.
Yeah, exactly. North Shore of Lake Huron, and Michigan and territories, around there, and so. Lumber becomes important, and there is a tradition of timber companies coming in and leasing land, and sort of they take over those subsequent companies take over those leases, and that's one of the biggest contributing factors to the colonial nature of the acid plant. And because what happened was, as one lease expired, it became clear that it was actually a land purchase, although that was not clear to community members. And that's one of the things that I outline in the book. Anyway, the community bought the land back. using banned funds, and it was never actually returned in accordance with the Indian Act to the community in the way that it should have been, even under Indian Affairs and Ottawa legislation. And so that actually allows Indian Affairs then by the 1950s to say, oh, well, this actually was never returned properly. We can lease this land back to Noranda. And so this is one of the really problematic aspects of it. And when we're talking about extraction as tied to colonialism, this is one of those prime examples. But it is a part of a larger tradition of leasing land, not just at Serpent River First Nation, but this is something that has happened in other communities as well, where land is leased, and that becomes a precursor then to dispossession.
Yeah, it ties together a lot of the case studies for other First Nations communities across Canada that have similar, I guess, administrative experiences with the Canadian government, among other components to the story that you tell here as well. And calling back to that earlier episode, I mean, it's directly connected what ends up happening with the mining, but it also illustrates an unbroken continuity in the history for the community and its role in asserting sovereignty rights and protection of land and water. This is not necessarily shifting gears, but this is a question for the historians listening in the audience. As a historian, you've got a whole suite of sources that you're using here in this book, and you're integrating oral history research with documentary evidence as well. So I wonder if you can tell us how you approach that, how you balance those two types of sources and what they each brought to your analysis of the story that you tell in this book.
Yeah. So just to start, the reality of archival research in Canada, especially when dealing with Indian Affairs records, so RG10 primarily in my case, is that these records are kept by government agents with their own particular views of Indigenous peoples, usually negative, who are trying to change, who Indigenous people are, how we live our lives. And so you have to dig to sort of find Indigenous perspectives, which I was able to do in some cases. But I think one thing that I would like listeners to keep in mind is that these are government records that detail our colonial relationship and the destruction of our home territories. And the story, therefore, necessitated documentary evidence, certainly, but also oral history as well, to get a sense of what that lived experience was like. And so I noted in the introduction that some parts of the story were more easily told through documents. So, for instance, when trying to talk about the devastation of the watershed, I used government correspondence quite a bit. And then also through oral history, which demonstrated the lived experience of what those numbers meant in those memoranda, right? So what did rising rates of radioactivity mean for Indigenous peoples in terms of being able to relate to the territory and relate to the land? And sometimes oral history, especially when talking about the resilience of Indigenous peoples, was through oral history, and that often pointed me towards newspaper articles as well, where I could see quotes from our chiefs through various time periods, being able to send those messages in very public ways, but so still being able to get a sense of what Indigenous voices and experiences were bringing to bear on this discussion. And so one example that I thought was when you're talking about the relationship between these two sources, they're very different, obviously. When they come from different traditions, they come from different cultures. But one of an example of using documentary evidence and oral history together was one elder who was able to recount exactly what the Noranda lease had said from memory. He had talked, like he was drawing on that lease in his oral history interview. And I had not yet seen that lease because it was in a different area. I had to go searching for it, and it wasn't where I thought it was going to be. And I thought that was immensely impressive to have that. To have that elder have that just intimate knowledge of what was going on, because he had been fighting so long to be able to have that that story reconciled in a lot of ways, to have that the acid plant site cleaned up, to draw attention to the river pollution. That was impressive and moving, and I think one of the biggest learning pieces for myself as an historian.
So, I mean, there's so much I want to say about this book. I think it's really important. And all of the new scholarship that's coming out on 20th century Indigenous history in what's now Canada is adding so much to our understanding of the period after the Second World War, but also to our understanding of changing ideas about the environment and environmentalism. And in some important ways, disrupting, I think, the narratives about the histories of environmentalism in North America. And I wonder if you see this in the same way, but we're Indigenous peoples in this community being activated to think about the environment and their homelands as part of a broader environmental movement, or Indigenous peoples leading and pressing and changing the way that settlers thought about the environment. Because in this case here, as opposed to, say, the Mackenzie Valley gas pipeline hearings, where you have Southern settler environmental groups trying to get involved with an environmental activist movement with Indigenous people, but there are no settler environmental groups at play here. Some of the tourist associations, I guess, are concerned, but this seems to be primarily led by Serpent River First Nation.
Yeah, and from my understanding of the from the oral history, and also some of the newspaper evidence, is that when there was an outside group, it was actually the National Indian Brotherhood, so the forerunner to the Assembly of First Nations, that became involved to assist in terms of I think the approaches to activism and for pressing for remediation. And so, yeah, it's not. In some cases, yes, the tourism operators are helpful. They see the same problems, and also union leadership also see from the mining companies see environmental devastation and also safety as being tied together. And so, there are relationships that are built that way. But I think that the biggest one that came through for me was the Assembly of First Nations when we're talking about outside organizations. And so it, to me, seems incredible, like, Indigenous led, and I think some of the reporters perhaps were influenced in terms of their questions and perhaps their empathy for the story by larger environmental movements. But I really see this as an Indigenous story that is Indigenous led.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and increasingly, at least for historians of Canada, there just isn't any way to think about environmentalism as a phenomenon in the 20th century without situating Indigenous activism at the center of the environmental movement in Canada. And more of these case studies, I think, are emphasizing that point and showing the ways in which environmental impact assessment review processes were influenced and shaped by Indigenous activism, and weren't necessarily leading processes for rethinking our relationship with nature. I guess the last question here is about the current state of things, the waters and the lands of Serpent River First Nation. Can you tell listeners a little bit about what the conditions look like today?
So I can share that the acid site is still a problem, and the land has limited use. So there have been several studies undertaken by the community, paid for by the community, to be able to get a sense of what that land could be used for, and to what extent it has been damaged. And so, and also because I mentioned it is on the side of arid bay, what is the relationship also between the land and the water and at that particular site? And so. This is not a site where you will be able to build houses or be able to use it for purposes in that way. And so, and again, it's in the middle of the community. And so this is something, the rocks, some of them are still red. You can see the residue still on them, which are, a testament to the legacy that is ongoing. In terms of the watershed, that is still being monitored and assessed. So there are annual reports that have to be submitted to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission by Denison and Rio Algom, who still do assessment in this area. Mm-hmm. And for me, that speaks to the perpetual care that will still need to remain in place forever to monitor and protect this watershed. And to talk about the interviews again, the elders I interviewed underscored and understood that this was paramount to wellness in our homeland, and that they were concerned about what this meant for the future of the community and the land. They were concerned about technologies that were human made and their capacity to hold water if it's contaminated, the impact that would have on the watershed if anything were to happen to those dams or to the technologies that kept those tailings management sites in place. And so this is something that will forever be a concern for our community, because that is still what we're left with. And that's the reality of the situation, is that those mines have been closed for decades now, and we're still waiting and watching and making sure that we can that water is still there.
And for listeners who want to read the full history here and get the full story, learn more about Elliot Lake, Serpent River, the book is Serpent River Resurgence: Confronting Uranium Mining at Elliot Lake from University of Toronto Press. Leanne, thanks so much for joining us and telling us about your book. And I hope that listeners go out to better booksellers and get a copy.
Thank you so much, Miigwech. Thank you for having me.
Nature's Past is produced in Toronto on the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabeg Nation. The current treaty holders are the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. This show is produced with support from the Network in Canadian History and Environment. This episode was made by Leanne Leddy and me, Sean Courage. Music for Nature's Past was licensed by Creative Commons. For details on the artists, please take a look at our show notes at niche-canada.org/naturespast, where you can also download new episodes, subscribe to the podcast with your favorite podcast player, and leave comments. You can also follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/naturespast. You can always find out more about environmental history research in Canada from the Niche website at niche-canada.org. And if you want to support this podcast and Niche, you can make a donation at niche-canada.org/support. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Nature's Past.